guys, I'm Emiline, aka Winterstar Cosplay, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of the making of series for my Lady Loki cosplay. In part 1, I went over how I added all the fancy things to the dress and made the cape, while in this video, I'll be talking about how I did the armor, the crown, and the jewelry, as well as briefly going over the makeup for it. So let's go ahead and get started. One of the first things that I did was design a pattern for the headpiece, since that was one of the parts of the cosplay that I was most excited for. I did end up going back and altering it even after I had cut it out of foam because I found out it didn't quite work with the horns, but this is how I started, doing a sketch, holding it up to my face, and adjusting the fit until I had something I was happy with. To make the pattern for the horns, I took some aluminum foil and formed it into a curved horn shape, wrapping it in plastic wrap and duct tape, and then drawing on marks where I would be able to cut it off, tracing it onto paper and cutting those pieces out afterwards. This was a bit of a hassle and took some trial and error to find a nice design, so if you want to skip all the steps of patterning it, I do have a pattern available in my Etsy shop, which I will link below. For almost all of the pattern pieces, I traced and cut them out of 2mm EVA foam from TNT Cosplay Supply. I cut out the actual headpiece base one time while tracing all of the horn pieces twice, flipping them for the second time so that I would have two symmetrical horns. And this is what I ended up with, a bunch of curved foam pieces that I now had to glue together to actually make the horns. To glue everything together, I used barge contact cement, putting it onto a small piece of EVA foam to use it to spread the glue onto all of the thin edges. I then repeated this step for all of the horn pieces. After adding glue to all of the horn pieces and letting it dry, now I needed to connect them all. I very carefully lined them all up with the registration marks I added to the foam and then pressed them carefully together. Connecting them all took some time and precision, but overall I'm really happy with how the horns turned out. Like I mentioned earlier, I did have to actually redo the base for the horns since after making the horns themselves, I realized that they would not fit onto the headpiece, which was a problem. To fix this problem, I traced the original headpiece onto more 2mm foam and increased the size of the headpiece, measuring it with the horns themselves to make sure that they would actually fit this time. To give the headpiece a little bit more dimension, I opted to add a large detail piece in the middle of the headpiece. I sketched the design onto a thicker EVA foam and then cut it out. I wanted to sand the edges into a really smooth, even shape, so first I used my box cutter knife to round off the edges to make it so that I wouldn't have to get rid of so much foam later on with my Dremel. Speaking of which, after I had trimmed off all the edges, I used my Dremel to smooth out the edges to make a really nice, smooth shape. And this is what the end result looked like. I'm actually really happy with it. Of course, I still needed to attach everything and turn these random collection of foam pieces into an actual headpiece, so I started out by spreading contact cement onto all of the different pieces on the edges where I needed to connect them, then letting it dry and pressing everything carefully together. After I had glued everything together, I wanted to add a lot of details to this headpiece since I wanted it to be very fancy and elegant. I started out by sketching on detail ideas with a silver Sharpie. I added some really nice borders for it, as well as a bunch of swirly little details on the inside of the headpiece. Once I was happy with the design, I traced and cut out the border out of more 2mm EVA foam, gluing it on top of the headpiece with more contact cement. To make all of the little swirly details, I used 3D fabric paint, which I have linked below in the description. This is a very fun, versatile material that I've used to add detail to lots of different cosplays. For this one, I drew on a bunch of little swirling details and designs all along the inside of the border, mimicking the same design on the opposite side of the headpiece. To make the headpiece curve better to fit my face, I adapted a technique that I saw Allison Tabitha use on her YouTube channel for her Poison Ivy cosplay. I took some pieces of fabric and hot glued it to the inside of the headpiece, curving it before the glue was dry so that it would remain in a curved shape after it was dried. And as you can see, it actually worked out really well. Next, it was time to add an actual attachment for the headpiece so that it would stay on my head. I first started out by scoring the edges of the foam, making little crisscross cuts so that hot glue would seep into it better and better hold on the elastic that I hot glued on later. To make sure the elastic wouldn't come off, I also added more hot glue on top of it. Next, I'm going to be showing you how I made the different necklace pieces for this cosplay, since I wanted it to be very fancy and I felt like necklaces would be a good way to do that. I started out by sketching the designs onto paper and adding details until I found a shape and design that I was happy with. Next, I traced the two different necklace pieces onto more 2mm EVA foam and then cut them out. To make sure the details would be symmetrical on both sides, I carefully drew them on with a silver Sharpie and then mimicked it on the opposite side of the necklace. Next, to inlay details into the necklaces, I heated up the foam with my heat gun, then using a thin stylus tool to press in curved details. I also did this for part of the headpiece, I just somehow lost the footage for it. And this is what the necklaces ended up looking like after I finished. I also took a thin jewelry chain and some more hot glue and created an attachment method for the necklace. For the choker necklace, I just used Velcro. Next, I needed to create these shoulder pieces. I made the patterns for these by draping some old plastic wrap covered in duct tape that I had onto the shoulder of my mannequin and then sketching out a design. I then transferred that duct tape pattern onto paper, traced it onto 4mm EVA foam, and then cut it out. I then cut out several detail pieces out of 2mm EVA foam and then attached it with more contact cement. To create some inlay details for the shoulder pieces, I scored the foam with an X-Acto knife and then heated it up with my heat gun to open up the cuts a little bit and create some really nice details. I also added more details with 3D puffy paint. After I had finished constructing all of the foam pieces, it was time to prime it. I opted to use Flex Bond, which is a brush-on non-toxic primer that dries clear. I did several layers of Flex Bond onto all of the different foam pieces, including the headpiece, the shoulder armor, and the necklaces. Once the primer had completely dried, I did a base coat of black acrylic paint onto all of the foam pieces to give me a nice, smooth, even base coat to work with. For the actual gold color, I knew that I wanted it to match the detail pieces that I used for the dress, so I experimented with a bunch of different swatches of gold paint that I had on some paint swatch cards which I made, which you can get for free through a link in the description. I opted to use the brushed metal, brushed gold color from Folk Art to get a really nice, shiny look. It was also the color that matched the closest to the detail pieces that I used on the dress. And after I had finally decided on a color, I did several layers of the gold acrylic paint onto all of the different foam pieces, including the headpiece, the shoulder pieces, and the necklaces. I let the gold paint dry and then cure overnight, and then I started weathering. To do this, I watered down some black acrylic paint and then brushed it over the entire surface of the gold, patting most of it off again with a paper towel. This creates a really nice weathered effect, and it really matched what I wanted for the cosplay. I repeated this same weathering process for all of the foam pieces, doing several layers until I found a layer of shadow and weathering that I was happy with. And here's the finished crown after all of the painting and weathering was complete. It definitely looked really good and I was really happy with it. If you compare two pieces of armor, one that has been weathered and one that hasn't, you can really see a huge positive difference. I still needed a way to attach the shoulder armor to the actual cape, and so I opted to use Sew On Snap, which I mentioned in part 1 of the Making Of series. I took some scraps of fabric and sewed on a couple of the sew-on snaps to the undersides of the armor, sewing on the counterparts onto the top of the cape so that I could easily take the shoulder armor on and off. The final thing I wanted to talk about in this video was the makeup, which will be kind of a speedy process since I didn't get a ton of good footage. I started out by doing a basic face of makeup and then doing really dark, intense eyebrows. I also did some really sharp contour. In addition, I also did a really dramatic smoky eye look with dark eyeshadow as well as green to create a nice Lady Loki look. Green doesn't pick up super well on my camera, but I promise you that it's there. To do the dark lipstick, I looked for a long time for black lipstick, found out that you can't really find black lipstick unless it's Halloween, and then got two colored multi-sticks from Wet n Wild, which is a pretty cheap brand, but it actually worked out pretty well for what I wanted to do. I got two colors, one in black and then one in green, and first outlined my lips in the black color, and then added the green on the inside to make a really nice black to green gradient. I also painted my nails a shiny black, and then that was it! The cosplay is done. I hope that you enjoyed this making of series for my Lady Loki cosplay, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any of my future cosplay content. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.